I don't need this on my computer for infinity. Okay.
Thanks. And Lorraine, I see your question. How long is this expected to be? So normally we have about 45, like maybe 40, 45 minutes of conversation about the book, and then we open it up. We always end 90 minutes after we start. So I think you're here with me in Winnipeg, so we'll be done at 7. And also, I am joining you tonight from the beautiful Best Western Winnipeg Airport Hotel, which is located in Treaty 1 territory, the home and ancestral unceded territories of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, and Dakota peoples, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. And I see a few other folks have started to put their land acknowledgements in the chat, which you are welcome to do. And I'm really grateful to be here with you. If you follow me on Facebook, you know that after the American election, I said I was taking a bit of a break from social media, which was actually coincidentally like unrelated to the election. I just was feeling not 100% myself and needing to unplug from the internet a little bit. And then I promptly got sick, and today is my first day back at work.
Oh.
And so joining you from Winnipeg, where the National Indigenous Spiritual Gathering is recalled, and just ask for your prayers for the Indigenous Church this weekend as we do some discerning together around the relationship between the Indigenous Church and the non-Indigenous Church, and also what decision making and leadership looks like within the Indigenous Church. I'm very, very pleased to welcome my dear, dear friend, the Reverend Dr. Karen Hamilton. Karen is a United Church minister. She's a United Church minister's child. She holds a doctorate of ministry in Hebrew Bible and has written a number of books, including this one, including some preaching resources, and most recently, before she retired, she was the General Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches. And I'm sure that she will be happy to tell you all of the things that are very special about the Canadian Council of Churches, because it is in some ways unique and leading in terms of the way that we do ecumenism in Canada, in that it was the first and still one of the only councils of churches to have the Roman Catholic Church in Canada be a member church. I think in Australia that is now also true. But a well-seasoned, well-traveled ecumenist, known for her signature red that she is wearing tonight. So she is wearing black for Thursdays and black, but on the lower half of
The
her
bottom, yeah.
dress. Yeah. And also has been co-chair of the 2018 Parliament of World's Religions, and so has been also involved as, I think, an ecumenist, but also just in ministry in a lot of interfaith dialogue. She's the person that introduced me to Raja Khoury and Jeffrey Wilkinson, who co-authored one of our first books we read, The Wall Between. And we're really, really thrilled that you are here, you award-winning, well-esteemed, much globally beloved leader in our church.
Oh, Carmen, can you introduce me everywhere, anytime? Oh, lovely.
Yes,
Thank you.
always.
Thank you. I am very, very humbled, and I am very privileged to be here. Thank you all. It was a privilege to write the book, and we're going to talk about that now.
Yeah. Okay, so the first question is, why did you write the book?
Okay, and this is a really important question, and I told Carmen this before we officially started. The book reads a little bit, maybe more than a little bit, like a COVID project. It wasn't originally a COVID project. It has sort of 3 starting points, very Trinitarian. One was, and the book doesn't say this at all, but I think it's important background, and because it speaks to the premise of the book. I did a lot of work with the Millennium Development Goals, which have now become the Sustainable Development Goals, and trying to mobilize faith communities around these goals that have been put forward by the United Nations, basically for the mending of the world and for healing and for justice for women and children and for the entire creation. But when you start talking about them, people's eyes kind of glaze over sometimes, and it's really sometimes, often, hard to get people to engage. So one of the underlying premises of the book is why, but why related to a wide variety of complicated global problems. Why do we sometimes, human beings as we are, kind of throw up our hands or have our eyes glazed over and think that we can't do anything or not know what to do about some of the huge problems? There are 10 chapters in the book, and each one focuses on one of the huge global problems. So that was what was driving me, is how do we engage, really engage as individuals, as congregations, as faith communities in these huge global problems? So then, as you've heard from Carmen, number two part of this, and this will go back to another question I know the moderator has, my interfaith experience is extensive and it's global and it's very broad in terms of all of the faith communities. So I wanted to work with that. And then the third point of the Trinity was I went to my publisher. I've published 3 books with Novalis before, some of which, as Carmen alluded to, were award winners. I went to Novalis and said, what's missing in the Canadian landscape of faith publishing? What doesn't exist? And Novalis said, there is no interfaith social justice book in Canada. It doesn't exist. There are ecumenical ones, there are Christian ones, there are perhaps ones particular to other single faith traditions, but there is no broad interfaith social justice book in Canada. So I said, well, and when you put in a proposal to a publisher, you have to write why, you should be the one to write this book. And I went, I think I have the background for this. So that's how the book came into being before COVID, before we even knew that it was in China, before we knew it was anywhere. But then it worked well to write it during COVID. So that's how it came into being. And it was, and you can, for those of you who've read the conclusion of the book, it felt like standing on holy ground the entire time. Everything about it, everyone I spoke to, every word I wrote, every link I had to research, because you have to put links if you're going to have a concrete response to the issue. You have to put links in. It all felt like a real calling and ministry and a vocation and God-led.
I love that. I love it that you didn't write like a systematic theology of interfaith social justice action, right? Like it's not a research or like your opinion on it, that you're sharing stories, because I feel like I'm teaching a class with John Tutamnell at Union Theological Seminary and with David Carr this semester, and one of the things that John's working on is the importance of religious thought in a post-truth world. And when our society across in many different ways is becoming more polarized, I feel like sometimes those of us that are sort of more towards the like liberal, left-leaning side of the political conviction spectrum are very, very diligent students of whatever issue that we care about. And when folks who have a divergent opinion from us share their opinion, and they tell us their heart stories of like why their hearts are broken by the world, we respond with facts.
Right.
And that doesn't actually move the needle to like build community or to show empathy to each other very well. And so I love it that you wrote it in a way that is the stories of the people that you worked with on the book, because I think it also makes things tangible. And if your goal was to be like what can I as a single person of faith do to make a difference in the world, like you're highlighting these different leaders and what they have done and continue to do in the world, and then also make it in a way that is personal and tangible. So I can imagine like, oh yeah, I can imagine myself doing something like, if I'd been here during the TRC, like it's amazing that Priscilla got to go to every single event of the TRC.
Yes.
Not everybody had the
Yes.
opportunity to do that, or the commitment, like maybe people just went to one. But yeah, so I love the way that the book is written from that perspective. There was a couple, so the first question, or one of the first questions that I asked you in our sort of pre-meeting was around, the book did get written during COVID. And so people that you were working with on the book were often talking about like, well, before COVID, and I know that these are people that you're in relationship with, and that have known, you have ongoing relationships with the people that collaborated collaborated on the book. And so do you, in your experience or based on the conversations that you're having with these different faith leaders, like what has changed since as we've settled into this sort of like new COVID is endemic and many things have gone back to pre-COVID, in terms of like public health measures and things like that, but like our world is radically altered from COVID too. So like what's changed since you wrote the book that you know of?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the stories, and I love the fact that you love the fact that it focuses on stories. The stories are all pre-COVID.
Yeah.
So that sort of sets the context. So when people are reading it, as everyone will want to after this evening, it's important to know that they're all pre-COVID. So how are things going back? It varies. It's one of those questions where, the answer varies. I mean, is racism still rampant? And the racism chapter, actually, the interviewee was Michael Blair, our own General Secretary at the United Church. We know those things still exist. And we know that COVID slowed down some of the responses. So what Carmen and I have also been talking about, with each other sort of right now, is the fact that I asked each person two questions. I mean, many questions, but there were two particular questions that were the same for every single interview. And one was, do you see any progress or hope in the issue that you have been engaged in? But the other one was that question of what can an individual do? So, and every single person I spoke to had answers like that for both those questions, which was remarkable. I didn't expect that everyone would see progress and hope and have such fast answers on what an individual can do. So all of that to say, things are moving again, but these issues are huge. And the engagement in them did slow down during COVID, but it is going back and they're not going away. The last chapter in the book is on climate change. I mean, we just, walked through, less than satisfactorily, the COP29 process. So the issues are continuing to be engaged in, and the people, as you say, Carmen, the people who are engaged in them, who I had the privilege of interviewing, are still engaged in them and are still working on them.
Yeah. Well,
So,
like one of the notes I wrote in the margins of my book was in chapter 4, a candle is lit against the darkness on refugees in the Baha'i community. And that's interesting because like I knew a little, like, I mean, maybe like an intro to world religions chapter on Baha'i faith, but I didn't understand its origins in Iran or the fact that there was religious persecution there. But on page 47 and 48, talking about since the Syrian program, Canada has been resettling a large number of refugees, and many other countries, concerns have been raised about sponsoring large numbers of refugees. Many citizens have raised questions about why their countries are doing so. This has generally not been the case in Canada. Would you care to revise that statement?
Yeah. I mean, this was written, the publication dates, this well, moderator. Publication dates are what publication dates are. So the book came out a year and a half ago, which meant that it had to go to press more than 2 years ago. So yes, and that was an issue all through the writing of it in every chapter. So the book was actually just finished when the indigenous graves were discovered in Kamloops.
Got it.
So I had to go back. And I mean, you couldn't send it to print without acknowledging that in the chapter on Indigenous realities. And I think it's important for people to know that chapter, if you haven't read the book yet, that chapter, the interviewee is an Anglican bishop in whose diocese I am currently residing as a United Church minister, who is Métis. And that's the Priscilla that you referred to, who was at all of the TRC. At all the TRC Commission events. But yes, that is the problem with writing any book, is that at some point you have to actually push send on the manuscript. And the Kamloops graves got in. The current debate around immigration and refugee status in Canada, obviously 2 years ago, was very different than it is now. However, I like to think, and I anticipated this question, I like to think that people reading the chapter can still get a great deal out of it in terms of what their concrete reaction can be, and do some of the translation around the changes, and and there are changes, but the same is true of anything you publish ever, but the premises are the same. We are called to protest injustice. We're called to mend the world. Those protests,
Well,
those are the same.
and I appreciated the way that you and Dr. Cameron kind of laid out the difference between migrant and refugee, because I feel like in current public discourse, those two terms get conflated a
Totally.
little bit, right? Or a lot.
A lot.
And especially like in the US with the, this conversation about like illegal asylum seekers. Like by law, you can't actually be somewhere illegal as an asylum seeker, because if you're seeking asylum, you're seeking
Asylum. Yep.
asylum.
Exactly.
You can be in the country like against immigration law as a migrant worker and overstay your visa or come without a visa or something like that. But that's not the same as seeking asylum.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah.
And Jeff Cameron's point still holds that one of the differences in Canada, and we'll see, moderator, how this plays out, is that most Canadians have at least a tangential connection with a refugee person or family. A few degrees of separation, but that's quite different than in some other countries. But that is our Canadian reality. So yeah, we'll see. We'll live in hope. We'll work concretely for justice.
Okay, my other question that I had was around the Rings of Peace.
Oh, but you also want to ask the United Church of Canada one though, too.
Did I?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, let's ask. Okay, let's ask that one first, because maybe probably people will have other questions about Rings of
Yeah.
Peace.
Okay.
So like our General Secretary Michael Blair is in here, and which I love because he was the first Black Canadian to serve in a senior leadership role in any denomination in Canada.
Major
Major
denomination.
denomination. Yes.
There comes
Okay.
my Canadian Council of Churches thing,
Yes.
right?
Major
Yeah,
denomination.
major
I'm so sorry.
denomination.
Yes.
Yeah.
In the biggest Protestant Canadian denomination. How about
There we
that?
go. Perfect.
And I was teasing him today because now that because he was also very like brand new in his job when you were doing the research for this book. And
Yes.
so now he's like lived into this job for a few years, and has been a bit of a lightning rod on some issues in terms of like, and I think that that's just luck of the draw when you're general secretary, right? He gets delegated work from the general council, and then not all of that's popular, and he has to implement it and engage the church on it. And so I said to him, I've just read Karen Hamilton's book, and I just read your chapter, and are you still worried that people are not going to question your decisions?
Yes. Isn't that a great line? That was such a
They're
great
going to
line.
be
Yeah.
scared. They're going to, like, I said, is that still a fear you have? And he's like, no, it is not.
But at the time, again, 2.5 years ago.
Fair though, right?
Yeah.
Like I see that in the Indigenous church sometimes. Or I have seen that, not so much anymore, but when I was younger, like and some of these folks have passed on now, but people like saying and doing pretty outrageous things within the Indigenous church, and the non-Indigenous church tolerating behavior that they wouldn't from a non-Indigenous person.
Right.
But like we're scared to say anything because they were scared that they'd be perceived to be racist by saying, I don't like your behavior.
Yep.
Right.
So I think you wanted to ask me, was it intentional that there's only one United Church person in the book?
Yes.
And the answer is absolutely 100% yes.
And why?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the purpose was to write an interfaith social justice book. So there are only 10 chapters. See, that's the other thing that publishers do, is they tell you the book can only be this long. There can only be this number of chapters and this number of pages. And so you're restricted with parameters right from the beginning. And so if it's going to be an interfaith social justice book, it's got to cover as many faith communities as it can. It's also, if you do the counting, if anyone has done this, you will notice that in terms of gender, given the fact that still most faith communities have male leadership, it's actually quite high in the female senior leadership number. And so, but you have to profile all the faith communities. So as it was, so Christianity, and you have to profile, I mean, I was general secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches. You got to have a Roman Catholic, or it doesn't represent the Canadian landscape. You've got to have an Anglican, it doesn't represent the Canadian landscape. United Church, you've got to have an evangelical, or it doesn't represent the Canadian landscape. So that's the Salvation Army chapter. But then you've got to have Judaism, Islam, Hindu, Baha'i, Like you've got to, if it's an interfaith book, it's got to cover all those things. So really, One United Church person was as far as I could go. There's so many that would have been fabulous to interview, but this
If
is
you
much more
could,
broad spectrum.
if you could have added more perspectives, like I mean, I'm sure it was really hard to limit yourself to 10
It
stories.
was really hard. It was
So
really, really hard.
what are some of the other stories that you had to cut that didn't make the book that you would like you're bursting to share in terms of like, because I
Well,
noticed there's no Buddhist perspective in here, right?
no, there isn't. There isn't. So actually, I'm going to reframe that question. I actually don't have the stories I'm bursting to tell, although, really I do. But I couldn't even interview those people because I knew I couldn't put them in the book, right?
Right.
So I couldn't even approach them because I
Let,
knew I
let
was
me
so
interview you. Oh, sorry, you're not in my top 10.
right. You didn't make the cut. So I
Right.
couldn't do that. And my publisher, it was quite funny actually. At one point, they said, "What are you offering people in order to, allow you to interview them?" I said, "Nothing. I'm just asking them to
Nicely.
let me interview them." I mean, as you say, I knew them all but two, and the other
Yeah.
two were referred to me through good colleagues. So, but this is actually not just, amusing. But I do have another answer to that question. I knew these were stories that needed to be told. And so that I knew that when I approached people that I had worked with for decades, most of them, 8 out of 10, that they would say yes because they were deeply grounded in the stories and the vision and the ministry and the justice. And they wanted the world to hear not what they were doing, although
Mhm.
that, of course, comes in the interview, but about the importance of the issue. What is the Salvation Army doing around human trafficking? I mean, they
Mhm.
are the Christian leaders in this. I know sometimes the United Church feels that it has great leadership role, and it does, but there are other faith communities or Christian communities who are taking great leadership roles. And so the Salvation Army, so it had to be the Salvation Army around human trafficking, for instance.
Right.
But
Because
if the
some of the
book,
other big global leaders on that are not in Canada, right? Like the Church of Sweden
right,
and some of the IKD and stuff.
that's right. And that
Yeah.
not all two of also 8 of my 10 are Canadian, but two were not.
Mhm.
Because also the why are those balloons? I don't know why that happens on my screen. Every once in a while, it just randomly happens. I didn't touch anything, I promise. Um, but the publisher also, Novalis also wanted it to be able to take it to an international audience as much as possible. So
Got it.
the Hindu leader, senior Hindu
Mhm.
leader in the UK, and the Armenian leader on the chapter on genocide
Mhm.
is from the United States, but he knows Canada well. Anyway, if I'd had the opportunity, yes, I would have interviewed a Buddhist. Yes, a Zoroastrian, uh, a Jain.
Mhm.
There are lots of others, but I had to choose, and it was hard. It was just really hard. But these
Mhm.
were stories that I knew, and I could only do 10, so I only did 10. But yeah, United Church only got 1 out of 10 is actually pretty good. In the entire interfaith spectrum of Canada, the United Church got one chapter.
Wow, that's good. We like that.
Okay, keep going,
Okay,
moderator.
so the Rings of Peace. And my preface to the book club about this is I started to say this to Karen and Alan before we opened the room up is um after October 7th,
7.
the Chief External Relations Officer for CIJA, which is the Canada Israel Jewish Affairs organization, had said to me at some point something made reference to be like, where are your rings of peace now, or something like that, which
Mm,
I didn't really know the story of the rings of peace until
mhm,
I read Karen's book. But he said, like, why isn't the church doing something like this with both the Jewish community and the
the
Muslim
Muslim
community in
community.
Canada? And so one, it set the context in my brain for like, oh, okay, this is what he was talking about before he stopped talking to me at all. Um, and two, my assumption is the reason why the United Church hasn't participated in this is uh, because it wasn't a United Church, it wasn't a United Church
Initiative.
led thing.
Yeah.
And also like how much, even within our own denomination, I think it's hard sometimes to like we have these networks across the church that are concerned with like particular issues. And so We have the NJEPI folks that are, advocating for peace from a Palestinian perspective, and we have people who are very involved in Christian-Jewish dialogue. We have people working for guaranteed livable income, like the very Reverend Marion Party, who's going to talk to us about that next year. But that, like, you can't know all of the things. And one, do you know if the Rings of Peace have continued, or has October 7th just like really, like, the best way I can think of it is like that when you have the wrong sides of magnets to try to come together and it just kind of
Right. Yeah,
repels each other.
yeah.
Because
That's a good illustration.
I think I can't remember if when Raja and Jeffrey were on the book club with us last November, if they were talking about that, like, for the first time in their working memories, like, Palestinians and Israelis like are in a place where they actually can't engage and talk with each other because everybody's just like too much in this like immediate trauma response of like this ongoing trauma that is happening. But from your perspective, like, is there still potential for this Jewish and Muslim interfaith dialogue here, and where is that happening, if it is at all?
So we need about a week to respond to this question and all the levels in the question. So I'm going to just try to start and do it as kind of chronologically as you have done it, or follow the points in your question, moderator. So I do have to start by saying that the Rings of Peace were written about 2.5 years ago. So people do
Yeah.
have to know that. And for those of you, I think it's just helpful, 2 sentences on what they are for those who might not have read this, chapter number 1 in the book. And it's very deliberately chapter number 1. That was another part of the writing. When you're writing an interfaith social justice book, is what order are you going to put the issues in? They're all dire. They're all hard. The interviewees were all amazing. So how do you decide where you're going to start? And so I deliberately put Rings of Peace first because it's perhaps the most unexpected. And I thought maybe it would trigger people's interest. I mean, you were also right to talk about the refugee immigrant diversity. And, if people want to talk about more stories later, we can talk about our Sikh colleague who kept getting thrown off a Via Rail train. That's, another story that people don't know. But okay, so what happened, Rings of Peace, very short version, is that there were terrible things that happened to mosques in Canada. Mosques were firebombed, there was graffiti, there was terrible, terrible things that happened to mosques. And the Jewish community came out very deliberately during times of worship and formed human rings around the mosque to show that their Muslim colleagues, that they were standing behind them in solidarity, that they were protesting these terrible acts, and that they were there to protect them, to honor their spiritual practice of prayer. So that happened. And then when the Tree of Life Synagogue in the United States in Pittsburgh had the just horrific murders committed against people there, the Muslim community came out in Canada. In the United States, this happened as well, but I'm just writing from the Canadian perspective. The Muslim community in Canada came out and they formed Rings of Peace around the synagogues in Canada at times of prayer, getting to know people, showing their solidarity for the spirituality, showing their protest, because the book is called Faith is Protest, against these terrible acts of injustice. So there it is in a nutshell. Okay, I want to say some tough things about the United Church. In my experience, I have been an ordained United Church minister for a very long time and very faithful to my denomination. I've had the privilege of working with 26 other denominations very, very closely. But the United Church sometimes in its past has not known when to act or how to act. And this is also true of other Christian denominations, but I see it more because it's my denomination. And one should always just speak from one's own denomination. So the concrete example, which is not in the book, I don't think, as I recall, is that there was a terrible act committed against a mosque north of Toronto. And the Jewish community was out in full force to indicate their solidarity, to be compassionate, to stand with those Muslim colleagues. There wasn't a Christian in sight. And I found this out, and I called a United Church colleague whose congregation I knew was very close to the mosque. And I said, "This has happened. Where are you?" And that United Church minister immediately leapt right in, took the congregation, went over there, was a marvelous presence, but had to be prompted, whereas the Jewish community was there immediately. And in reverse, when the Jewish community, has experienced horrendous acts, the Muslim community is there much faster than the Christians. So there is something that still is in our past, I believe, about being, and you referred to it, moderator, being the largest Protestant denomination in the country has made us, and I know we are all so well aware of declining enrollment and financial issues, and all of those things are real, very real. But we still carry a level of complacency that I at least see, not everywhere. And, probably not true of anybody on this Zoom call, but something I have seen and experienced. So having said all that, that's still putting it prior to October 7th. Since October 7th, and people should also know that for 12 years, I have been teaching a course for Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Israel and Palestine. So I have significant experience with all faith traditions, including the Druze, another faith tradition I would have loved to have interviewed, but they're mostly in Israel, Palestine. But I have significant experience with this and the way the three faiths relate or not in Canada and in the land. Since October 7th, it's been painfully difficult. People have been reaching out, some. Christians have been reaching out less than some others. And that's a hard thing to hear. And it's a hard thing to experience. And just in finishing up the Rings of Peace, also when people read the chapter, they will discover that when there was an attack on a Christian church in another country, the Jewish and Muslim community came out to support the Christians here in Canada. They were right there. Again, they were right there. We are slower to react. So post October 7th, yeah, in many places, it's like the illustration you used about the opposite poles of the magnets. Both sides, and there's at least 5 sides. When you're in the land, it's very incorrect to talk about 2 sides. There are at least 5 different major realities in the land. But everybody's hurting. And Jeffrey and I mean, I work really close with Raja, and I've been interviewed by Raja and Jeffrey. Everybody's hurt. Everybody is terribly hurt. And Raja and Jeffrey work so hard in their book at pointing that out and talking about how everybody is victimized. And it's a much more complicated question. What we also have sometimes difficulty with in the United Church is remembering history. And so history in the Middle East does not go back to 1973, 1967, 1948, 1900. It's 5,000 years at least. And people carry the weight of that. And so that's important to know. Palestinian community in Canada, of which Raja is an active member, are in terrible pain and hurting badly. And we have been emailing since October 7th. The Jewish community in Canada is in terrible pain and hurting badly. And we have been emailing since October 7th. And why is my phone ringing? Somebody is calling me from Vancouver. Okay, I'm not answering. It's not the moderator.
It's not
so
me.
I'm not the moderator, so I'm not going to answer. So my wrist is vibrating. Anyway, the hurt and the pain is extreme. And I know people talk about not the numbers. The death toll in Gaza is absolutely unbelievable, beyond unbelievable. And on October 7th, many of us were saying that we knew that was going to happen. The hostage situation, the over 100 hostages who were captured by Hamas and are still in Gaza, is absolutely horrific. The pain and sorrow is huge. People are feeling, I said this before, like victims. So for instance, members of the Jewish community have told me, this goes back to what I was saying before, nobody has called us. The rabbis of the synagogues say this, nobody has called us. We are not responsible, whether they are we are not those who are, currently bombing Gaza, but nobody calls us. And one rabbi said to me, I'm a Canadian citizen, and I have never felt so alone in my entire life. Nobody calls, nobody comes for coffee, nobody visits. And by that rabbi meant particularly the Christian community. And I find that very painful. And Palestinian colleagues, say the same. So we can't solve the Jewish Muslim, Jewish Israeli Palestinian Muslim dynamic as it plays out in Canada. But as Christians, we could sure do a lot more. So I was asked to speak on Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day of the Jewish year. And the topic may feel a bit shocking to some. I think not to others. I think not to you moderator, not to Marion Party, not to many on this call. But I was asked to speak at one of this country's largest synagogues, and there were thousands of people there. Thousands. The synagogue holds thousands of people, and they were all there. And I was asked to speak on Jewish Christian dialogue, because Jewish Christian dialogue in this country has completely collapsed since October 7th. And I don't have, if I had easy answers, I would say what they were, of course. I know that phone calls, emails, texts, asking people how they are and how their families are makes a difference. Would I write Rings of Peace differently 2.5 years later? Of course. Is it really happening right now, the Rings of Peace themselves? No. However, moderator, because I will end this, as every chapter ends in the book, on what can individuals do and where there is some hope. So there are two organizations that I'm engaged with. One is called Standing Together. And if people are not engaged in that, please look them up and join. Standing Together is an organization of Jews and Palestinians, and they hold events all across the country and all across the world. And for those of you in Toronto, there was just an event this last Sunday at the corner of Bloor and Yonge. I've been at one that was at the corner of Bloor and Avenue Road, and it simply brings together Jews and Palestinians to say, we want this to end. We want justice for all. We are standing together to call for justice for all. And it's a visible presence. Everybody wears purple. The other organization is Project Rosanna, and some of you, again, moderator and Carmen, I know in particular, know that this is where much of my passion and work and fundraising goes these days. Project Rosanna is an organization of Jews and Palestinians, Christians, Muslims, in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, in Germany, in Israel and Palestine, who are working together to build bridges of understanding between Israelis and Palestinians through the amelioration of the Palestinian healthcare system, because it's before October 7th was not in good shape. It's dire now. Project Rosanna we have a medical tent clinic in Gaza right now. And we have been able to work 2 weeks after October 7th. So people think nothing is happening in the land, and that the situation is so terrible, and it is so terrible. But there's lots of stuff happening on the medical front, and lots more that could happen. But so those are two organizations of hope in terms of what Canadians and individuals and faith members of the United Church of Canada can do. And as I said, the questions you've asked are a week in answering at least, and none of the answers are easy.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard. Like I think when October 7th first happened, I reached out to every Palestinian and every Jewish person that I knew in Canada.
Yes.
And like some of you may know, my oldest uncle, my mom's adopted, we don't know this much detail, but um my mom was adopted by a United Church minister and his wife, and her oldest adopted brother married a Jewish woman because he came of age in Montreal, whatever. And so their only daughter, and they didn't stay married, but their only daughter is like my little sister. We're best friends, and she's Jewish. And like watching my Auntie Marcia just like it and she's lives with a lot of anxiety in general anyway, and some mental health challenges, but like just like live in this place of like activated terror
Yeah.
about um and she's not Zionist, she's like pro-Palestinian,
Yep.
and is a member
Yep.
of Independent Jewish Voices, and like Reform tradition, and so like understands like doesn't question like the calls for justice for Palestinians,
Right.
but also is like terrified of what
Yep.
the repercussions against Palestine were going to mean in terms of rises of anti-Semitism in Canada,
Yeah.
and what that would mean for
Which we've
her Jewish
seen.
grandchildren, right? Like
Yep.
that, like were her
Yep.
grandchildren going to be safe here?
Yep.
As people got angry about what Israel was going to do in retaliation for October 7th. And um,
Yep.
so one of the things I think that breaks my heart about the fact that Richard chose to stop talking to me was because his son was living in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv at the time, and his girlfriend was from a border town, like right close to where the October
Mm,
7th attack
that's
happened.
happened.
And he went closer to the border to be
Yeah.
with her because she refused to leave, and she lost immediate family members in that
Yeah.
attack. And like every day I would text Richard and say, "How's Olivier? Like, how are you doing? How's your family?" And when we signed the church joint letter between the executive and the National Indigenous Council saying we were concerned that there were reports coming that there was a concern that there was a possibility for genocide, and that we were calling on the Canadian government to pay particular attention to and to uphold international law to make sure that that didn't happen in a proactive way.
Yeah.
And his response was like, now that you've accused me as a Zionist of like the most unimaginable crime possible, I can't continue this friendship. And I was like, well, first of all, I don't think that you're guilty of that. And we
Mm,
raised a concern about the possibility of it happening. And I really, I can't force you to be my friend. And
yeah.
that's not my choice. And I can't, I just want you to know that I'm still going to be here if you ever
Yep.
change your mind.
That is what you can do.
Yeah.
That is what you can do. That's what we can all do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's
But
hard.
I do think that like we could do better at I mean, it's this tough thing where like a lot of people in the church are tired,
Yes.
like,
Yes. Yes.
right? We're
Yeah.
tired because like even just the way that we do our governance is like represents a different era and different speed of
Yeah.
life in the work, and it's weighty and burdensome, and like people who I think spent many decades of the best years of their lives being very very active in church, they're just like, now we have access to so much information, and we have so many existential threats and so
Yep.
many problems. And then you add that onto like, are you going to make your congregational budget this year? And is your church still going to be open next year?
Yep.
It
Yep.
becomes hard to like be like, oh yeah, and we're all human, and I'm going to go sit with my Jewish neighbors or my Palestinian
Yep.
neighbors and just say like, I can't fix it, but I'm here with you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that's all true. And that's all true. Alan just asked what the name of
Yeah.
the organization was. So Project Rosanna. But you also would find it, we've just recently changed the name. So it's called Rosanna Health Diplomacy. Just Google Rosanna, Rozana, and it all comes up. And it's based on a true story
Rosanna
about
Health, what?
diplomacy. I
So you
didn't vote
called
for, I
yourself
didn't,
a
I didn't vote for that, just saying. But Rosanna Health Diplomacy.
there
But
we
if you
go.
just go, there you go, from Carmen, there we go. And it's based on a true story of a Palestinian girl from Gaza, actually called Rosanna,
All
and
right.
how her life was saved. So it's actually very inspiring. But yes, so concretely, if I was going to translate that concretely, Carmen, the story you just told, I
Yeah.
would say that that's right. That is what you do. So what if each one of us on this call, or everyone we know, just sent a message, one a day, one a day. And you, I mean,
Mhm.
you've lived that. You've absolutely lived it. And there's no guarantees. That's right. People will choose to stop talking to us. Absolutely. Others will respond. We've all done this. You know what? All of us who have walked through the valley of the shadow of grief with people. And we know this, that when people are deeply grieving, you send messages, you leave a voicemail, they may not respond, but
Mhm.
they've heard it.
Yeah.
They've heard it. So he's heard you. And,
Mhm.
you know, what if all of the rest of us who don't know what to say, and, you know, goodness knows I should know what to say. And I've made so many mistakes talking with Jewish colleagues and Palestinian
I
colleagues since
know. No, I'm
October
kidding.
7th. I've made so many mistakes. But
I'm teasing. I'm so awful.
yeah,
Sorry.
it's so true. But so here's the thing though. So in the first place, one of the other things that also the moderator knows about me is I'm a huge fan of languages, and I speak 9. Um, Not because like it's like magic. I just work at it. As you say, it's hard and people are
Mhm.
busy and it's hard. But I have more, I listen as a frail human being, I listen more easily to people talking about the Middle East if they speak Hebrew and Arabic. Or one
Mm.
or the other. Both is better. And I've worked really hard to try to get both, and I mix them up. And there's another thing that people don't always know. Hebrew and Arabic, it is like a sibling rivalry. Hebrew and
Like
Arabic
French and
are,
Spanish.
yes, exactly. And
Yeah.
they're so similar. So people say to me, don't you mix them up? I say every sentence, basically. I mix them up. I start in Hebrew, I finish in Arabic, or the other way around. Happens continually because they're so similar, which in a sense, it just makes the whole situation more tragic. Um, but you know, we try. And as I said, I've made so many mistakes. But here's the thing. When I was leaving the Canadian Council of Churches, my Deputy General Secretary, Peter Notaboom, who some of you will know and know well and is just doing a fabulous job, and knew he was going into the interim position, and then, you know, then became later the General Secretary. But he said to me, as you're leaving, what's the one thing? What's the one thing? And he'd been there longer than I had. I was there 15 years. But the one thing you want us to know? And I said, the one thing I want you to know is to establish relationships ahead of time before there is
Mhm.
some dire tragedy, so that when there is a dire tragedy, you know who to call.
Yeah.
And so that was the mandate I left them with. So the same is true with our Jewish and our Muslim colleagues, and that doesn't solve it all,
Yeah.
Carmen, as you've lived. It just
Yeah.
gives a better chance
Well,
that,
and I think that speaks to the importance of like that do it, don't wait for something to
right,
happen, because one of the like people may know this, but I was the co-chair of the Palestine Israel Forum core group of the World Council of Churches, which is maybe not quite as diplomatic as Karen's position on the conflict, and has caused ripples within the Jewish
yeah.
community at the WCC level, and then also our advocacy for Palestinian justice in Canada has done the same. And um, when I when I heard Richard speaking to General Counsel in 2022 about being a pro-Palestinian Zionist, I was like, put my like best interfaith partner hat on and was like, oh, I'm gonna get curious about that and be like,
Mm.
what does
Oh,
that
totally.
exactly mean
It's
to you?
totally possible. Yeah, it's totally
and
possible.
and also I need to make friends with him first so I can fight with him about that later, right? And time wasn't on our side, right? So
Yeah, that's a problem. Yeah.
he lives in Ottawa, I live in Vancouver, and we just didn't have the depth and history of relationship to be able to sort of navigate what happened, especially given the fact that he has to speak for this like very pro-Israeli organization, and I had to speak for the church, and probably neither of the messages that were coming out of either of our mouths were exactly what our own personal sentiments were,
Yeah, yeah, sure,
quite
sure.
quite well aligned with our organizations, or we wouldn't be in the roles that we're in. And like it was hard. um Ian, okay, so we've gone overtime in terms of our conversation, so
Yeah.
I'm going to open it up to
Yeah,
the our
Ian really wants
crew.
us to do that question.
Yeah, well, no, because Ian's being good and following Alan's explicit direction, saying, please put in all caps, please read, so we realize it's a question.
Yeah.
So what advice do you have for interfaith dialogue on social justice issues such as LGBTQ plus rights, how to work effectively with people with significantly different views.
Okay, you want me to answer that?
Yes.
Have coffee. And I'm actually serious about that. And that is not meant fliply. Another United Church story, because, I'm United Church, is I had an older than me clergy person in the United Church who was trying to do the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity, and who wrote me when I was General Secretary in huge frustration, a personal letter in pen, not even an email, and said, I don't understand. There's just no ecumenism where I am. It's just not working. I'm trying to organize a Week of Prayer for Christian Unity service, and it's not working at all. And I called him. And I said, so talk to me about your process and what you've done and why you think it's not working. He said, well, we're the United Church. I just sent an email to all of the other Christian denominations in the area saying that I wanted to, organize a Week of Prayer for Christian Unity service, and, called them all to a meeting, and nobody responded. And I said, huh, did you go and knock on their doors and invite them out for coffee? And he said, what? So it's about the relationships. We've just been talking about this. So Ian, the short answer is it's about the relationships and going for coffee and talking to people. A more complex answer is interfaith dialogue. So get together with people when you're talking to them and having coffee, and ask also what they want to talk about. It's not always about the United Church's agenda, although the United Church has a great agenda in so many ways. It's not always about our agenda. The human trafficking, this chapter 2 in the book, human trafficking, I have found, is one that has been easier than some. Most of the issues in the book are very easy to bring people together on, but the human trafficking is in a way even easier than some. Everybody's really concerned. Nobody knows quite what to do. It involves a secular community. There are lots of things people can do. So, you start talking to people about, where I'm living right now is really close to the 401. The 401 highway between Toronto and Ottawa, Montreal is like the human trafficking corridor in the province, and if not in the country. So, you start working with an issue people really care about. The LGBTQ plus, I don't know whether you're thinking that would be difficult, but and again, everybody's hurting after October 7th, but before October 7th, the Jewish community had given a lot of thought to that, and had things they wanted to talk about that. Muslim community, if you read the chapter, the Canadian Conference of Muslim Women, they've given a lot of thought to that. Other communities already have. So invite people for coffee, cookies, make sure they're kosher or halal. In fact, a kosher is better because kosher is stricter than halal. So if in doubt, always serve kosher as opposed to halal. But just and say, this is what's on our mind. What's on your mind? How might we organize an event together? But you got to really do it. That was why I used the story that I used about the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity. You got to do it collaboratively and find out what everybody else's agenda is too. And housing, poverty, healthcare, all the faith traditions have strong and passionate and justice-oriented views on all those things. I don't know if that's enough of an answer or too much of an answer, Ian, but if you want to talk more, Alan or the moderator can give you my email address and you can write me directly.
It was a nice thumbs
Ian,
up
does
from
that
Ian
answer
there
your
too.
question?
So there was a thumbs up
All
emoji
right.
from Ian. So I think
I missed it. Any other questions for our esteemed author guest?
I can
Or
tell you
reflections?
other stories, or if a hush falls over the crowd, I can tell the Sikh story and getting thrown off the train. But I would rather hear people's questions and reflections and thoughts. And
Marianne, I see your hand.
she's muted,
There
I
you
think.
go.
Oh,
Yep.
Hello, Karen.
Hello,
And
Marianne.
moderator and everyone. Thanks so much. I had one question before this started. Now I have about 6 and equal number of comments. So I'll go back to the beginning, Karen. I know that you have a wealth of people in our interfaith world. So I'm given you already shared some of what the criteria for your discernment in terms of 10 chapters, who and what. But
Yeah.
in terms of all of the people that how
Yeah.
did you discern, like within
Who?
Judaism, for example, who to choose, or within the Muslim community? And may I just say, as a comment, in case I don't, I referenced your book and had it with me at our multi-faith
Oh,
group yesterday,
thank
and
you.
to our delight, every faith tradition that is in your book was represented in our room. So everyone was very happy with your book.
Oh, Marion. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Marion. Thank you. So how did I choose? That's a really great question. Sort of I went tradition by tradition. So I knew I wanted to profile the Rings of Peace story. So then obviously I approached the people who were involved in the Rings of Peace. So that was sort of easy in a way because they were the Rings of Peace people. I knew I wanted to profile human trafficking. So I knew who to approach, who's Christine McMillan. So this is another part of Canada's reality that we don't always in the United Church know. It is the former Canadian commissioner, Canadian commissioner of the Salvation Army, who heads up the interfaith committee working to combat human trafficking at the United Nations. This is our profile, folks. But it's not United Church, it's Salvation Army. So I knew her person. I knew the human trafficking had to be told. And then there's also my evangelical tradition. Okay, so I have Judaism and Islam and Rings of Peace. Then I've got the evangelical tradition covered through the Salvation Army and human trafficking. So racism, I mean, obviously, I know Michael well, and I really wanted to profile the United Church of Canada. And Michael's role is so unique. And for those of you who caught that when I gave the moderator a hard time, there are actually multiple denominations in Canada who have had a person of color as their senior leader, but they're small. And in fact, we have Black denomination in Canada, the British Methodist Episcopal Church. Anyway, so racism, I knew it had to be Michael, and I had heard parts of his story. The Baha'i colleague was a great gift, actually, because I know Jeffrey Cameron well, and I have worked with him on many things, but his doctorate was in the area of immigration and refugee. So that was just a divine convergence that the Baha'i tradition is so knowledgeable about that. And for people who don't know, and the moderator referred to this, it is the Baha'i community that first started bringing refugees, started as a faith community bringing refugees into Canada. A lot of people think that it was the Mennonites, and they were involved right off the top at the beginning as well, but it's particularly the Baha'is and the Mennonites who started us down this path of justice. I knew that anti-Semitism before October 7th, I knew how virulent anti-Semitism is. And again, divine convergence. Canada's leading scholar on anti-Semitism is Roman Catholic. So I just asked Murray, and he said, yes, of course. I knew the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. I knew that if you're, and this is where, life gets very, very complicated, as we all know, and the book was very complicated. There were many moving pieces all at the same time. So if you're going to profile anti-Semitism, you also have to, of course, obviously you want to talk about Islamophobia. Even though, read the chapter, if people haven't read the chapter, you'll find it quite startling in terms of what the Muslim women themselves, Order of Canada, Alia Hogman Order of Canada, have to say about Islamophobia. It's quite startling how it's a very recent development and what her thoughts are on it, speaking as a practicing Muslim. So it all kind of came together in those ways. I knew that I had worked with the Sikh lawyer, and so I knew that his area was religious freedom. So that brought in a Sikh and religion. So I was always balancing. I need the faith tradition. I want the issues. And I was always balancing and trying to see where they would fit. And then I knew that genocide is a reality in our world, and I knew that it had to be profiled. Well, who are those who have in recent history most experienced genocide is the Armenians. And so I had, because through the council, of course, had Armenian Orthodox colleagues. And they are the Armenian scholarship. Anybody who wants to follow up on that, the Armenian scholarship on genocide is unparalleled. It is unparalleled. And they take it through, all of the genocides, starting with their own, but then just, up to and they're working with the Uyghur community, and they're working with, the Israel-Palestine is very much on their minds. And so they're just absolutely unparalleled. The one that was trickiest, I will confess to you, my sisters and brother, I notice there are more sisters on this call. The hard one was actually climate, because I knew that I needed a Hindu, and I will go back to your question, moderator, about the Buddhist community and why they're not there. I knew that I needed a Hindu because it is there's so many Hindus in Canada, but I also knew that I had to have climate change. So there was a bit of a search to find, and I also knew I needed someone international. So I had to search a bit to find out who is a global Hindu expert on climate change. And it happened to be, and I tried a couple of routes on that, but it happened to be the person who is the chair of the Hindu Federation of the UK. So that one was a little bit trickier, because I had to fit things together that might or might not. The reason there is no Buddhist is because if there'd been chapter 11, there would have been. But also, and this is an interfaith reality that is obvious to many, but again, not all. The United Church, in spite of all of the processes, moderator, and my father, my mom was a diaconal minister. My father was the United Church of Canada's lawyer and parliamentarian. And the processes are very real. And where was I going with that?
Buddhism.
Thank you, Buddhism. So we have leadership and we have structure. Christians have structure. The Jewish community has structure. The Baha'i community has structure. The Muslim community, well, little bits of structure. The rest of the faith communities in Canada have very little. And it's simply because they are newer to the country. They don't have financial resources. And I know the United Church swears it doesn't have any money and believes that. But compared with the other faith communities, the United Church is rolling in money. And I know individual congregations don't feel that. But I had senior bishops. When I was at the Canadian Council of Churches, I had senior bishops of denominations whose entire infrastructure was their cell phone and their car. They had no staff. They had no physical office. They had a cell phone and they had a car. And they were the bishop or archbishop of an entire denomination working like that. So having said that, the Buddhist community is also in that kind of a way that it's very hard to know. Does anybody here, everybody will have a different answer, but does anybody here really know who the leader of the Buddhist community in Canada is? See, the Buddhists don't know that. Nobody really knows that. And it will come with time. It will come with time. And I have received many wise words from the Jewish community on this, because at times when I have been frustrated with other traditions, because I'm holding some fabulous event and I want everybody there, and I will say, please send out an email to everyone. And, it can't happen. And the mosques tell me why it can't happen. And the Hindu temples tell me why it can't happen, et cetera, et cetera. So it makes interfaith dialogue, much harder than one always thinks. Anyway, I have received wise words from Jewish colleagues who say, you know what? When we came to this country, many of us, we had no structure either. It will come. Karen, have more patience. Okay. Thank you. Have more patience, Karen. So, but that's why the same thing with the Zains and the Jains and the Zoroastrians. They're small, and I was only allowed 10 chapters. Really blame it on the publisher.
I mean, there is that. I think it's like partly a Protestant thing and partly
Yep.
a reform specifically thing, right? When my grandfather was on the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches, his BFF his ecumenical BFF was Patriarch Kirill, who but at that point was just like an archdeacon,
Yeah.
who's
And
now like
more, and
not
more
a great guy
restrained. Yeah.
and super aligned with the Russian state and power and everything
Super.
in really unhelpful ways. But my grandfather was having a conversation with him about why won't the Eastern Orthodox traditions ordain women. He said, "Oh, you Protestants, you're always in such a hurry. Give us 400, 500 years to think about it."
And
Which is like, you know, a bit of a patriarchal cop out
of
and
course,
also true, right?
but also
Like we
true.
think
Yeah.
sometimes our processes are slow, and from some other faith traditions and some other Christian traditions, we're perceived as like being a little bit rash sometimes in the Reformed tradition.
Yeah, that's so true. And just to speak to that, actually, one of the Orthodox traditions has, in the last pre-COVID, to go back to that paradigm,
Mm,
ordained a woman deacon. So one of the Orthodox traditions has done that. And so
nice.
they're moving. They're moving. And
Well, I know the Armenians have archival proof that they did have
yeah,
ordered
it's the Armenians who've
women
done it.
priests. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the
And
Armenians who've
they
done it.
told me when I was in Armenia in 2007 that they would eventually start to ordain women again because they had all of the
They have the
documentation to
documents.
prove
Yeah,
that this was true, but that they were busy trying to rebuild the church in a post-Soviet context.
yeah,
And they needed
yeah,
to rebuild the existing structures that people knew before they could reintroduce the
yeah,
ordination of women. And
yeah,
also they needed to like, you know, allow for that not to completely fracture their intra-Oriental Orthodox and intra-Orthodox conversations
yeah.
too, because that was going to
And
be a big challenge for folks.
yeah, and you're so right, Carmen. I mean, I'm such a diplomat, but the United Church is so far ahead in terms of ordination of women, to pick one issue. And we're so far ahead theologically in a way, and we're so far ahead on paper, but the reality can be different.
Mhm.
So when I was ordained and I became the senior preacher of a congregation in North Toronto, in the center of Toronto, I was still the first and only United Church ordained woman preacher in that
Yeah,
whole central part of Toronto. There were women
yeah.
who were ordained to pastoral care. There were women doing funerals. There were no women senior preachers. And
Mhm.
I will tell this story too. I applied, I became general secretary 2002. I 2002, I became general secretary. At the same time, I applied for a large United Church congregation, also in Toronto, a little further to one of the edges. And I was told in no certain terms that no women should bother applying. Women will
Mhm.
not be considered in 2002 as the senior preacher of the United Church congregation, a big United Church congregation. Now, they couldn't put that on paper because, the presbytery would have shut them down in a second. But um, so,
I've had that. I've had a wealthy large congregation say to me, "Don't you think maybe you would be better suited to the pastoral care position we're going to
yeah,
post next?" I'm like,
exactly. Yeah.
have you met me? Like, what about me screams pastoral care to anybody?
Yeah.
Um,
It's complicated.
yeah, the when I was in Greece for, I think like an executive committee meeting of the WCC in, I don't know, 2009. And I went for a walk with Bishop Sally Dick from the Methodist Church in the States, and
Yeah.
Agnes Abloom, who ended
Yeah.
up being the first woman to serve as moderator of the World Council of Churches. She was African, um, from Kenya, and we were walking, and I said, I just have fallen in love with the Armenian Divine Liturgy.
Mm,
And like,
yes.
if I wasn't born United Church, I would
I'd
choose to be born Armenian.
Armenian. Yeah.
And I was talking with one of their younger bishops when I was at the last General Assembly of the World Council of Churches, and he was like, "Is I said it's really weird how I have this like very, very strong attachment to Armenia and that my Armenian Orthodox friends. Because that's like United Church of Canada and Armenian Orthodox are not like the sister churches that you would put together even in an adopted
Mm,
situation." And he said, "Well, I think it's because you're Indigenous and you're also a second generation survivor of genocide." And I was like, "Oh,
yeah.
there's something."
There's,
But
yep.
also, So I said this to Sally, that I wanted to be Armenian Orthodox if I wasn't United Church. And she was like, you are an ordained woman. Like, how can you say that? And I was like, hey, look, at least they're honest about their treatment of
Yeah.
like women in leadership, right? Like
Yeah.
they're honest about where they're at. So, and we don't sometimes like to look at our shadow sides of the reality of who we say we are and who we actually are
They are. Yeah.
sometimes, right? Like when I was on General Counsel Executive, then there was a pay equity study about how women were paid compared to men in leadership in the United Church of Canada. And when they took all the equalizing factors
Yep.
out, like same level of education, same size congregation, like took out all of the variable factors and just compared apples to apples in terms of gender, they knew that we weren't going to be like at 100% equity, but they thought that we would be better than the Canadian average. And we were right on average, 73 cents on the dollar.
Yeah.
And the response from General Counsel Executive, and this was like almost 20 years ago, was, well, the report must be flawed. Like,
Yeah.
that is
Nope.
not who we are.
Nope. Nope. Nope.
Yeah.
Another thing people find
We're,
when we
we're diverging from interfaith dialogue. So
I know. But I'll tell one more United Church story, and then
okay.
that's right. We've got to go back to questions about the book. But so to remember, I'm in the era where so many Anglicans came into the United Church to be ordained because the Anglican Church was not at the time ordaining women, right? And so many people, and people are still doing that, thinking that it's easier to be female in the, oh, there's another, please read, good, on people thinking it's easier to be female clergy in the United Church. Actually, if you did a similar kind of study, you find that the Anglican women priests actually get less of a hard time than the United Church female ministers because, and this is going to sound a bit wacky to a United Church context, but if the bishop says, you have your choice of three, that's how it works in the Anglican Church. The bishop says, here are three candidates I think will fit for your parish. You pick. But once the bishop has then agreed with their choice and installed them, they're there because the bishop has said they're there. And so people generally, there are exceptions to everything, but people generally give them less grief. People give them less grief. So anyway, there's a question. Please read.
There's a question from Betty Kelly in Brandon, Manitoba. Building on your comments about the traditional versus actively social justice perspectives in the United Church, can we talk about why we are so often reluctant to take a visible stand on issues? Is it a fear of response of our congregation or our community?
No, it's complacency. It's another C word called complacency. I don't think as the United Church, and I can't speak, I don't have any idea what's going on in every United Church congregation across the country and contexts where that may indeed be the case. It's not how I have seen it. How I have seen it is that we are still the largest Protestant denomination in the country. And United Church ministers are still preaching sermons saying the United Church is on the cutting edge of absolutely everything and everybody else better get on board. And this actually happened truly in Toronto, and it was a huge problem I had to deal with at the Canadian Council of Churches. And everybody should be following us. And we're complacent. Now what you said, moderator, about people being tired is absolutely 100% true. 100%. And so that's for sure a factor. But there's also a complacency that we just don't think we need to bother. Or people should, like the story I told about the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity, people think that because we say something should happen, everybody should just kind of fall in line because we're the United Church and, we're the leaders, aren't we, on many things? Are we? But so no, I'm sorry to say that I see it, and I can't speak for every context by any means. I just see complacency sometimes where I wish I didn't.
All right, Yvonne Stewart, I see your hand raised.
Yes. I forgot.
Oh, you've turned your microphone off again.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Okay, can't see me. I can't get my video back on.
That's okay.
I guess the book made me think about protest.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking that we in the United Church in particular have to think about a different way of protesting. I come from a congregation where I would not say there's complacency. And
Great.
I speak with many others involved in social justice work. But I think we have such a feeling that we need to mend the world that you've referred to, that we have to jump on the bandwagon, figure out what the problem is, who's right, who's wrong, and take a position. And I think it's very interesting that in the introduction to your book, the rabbi talks about Abraham protesting. The protest is to God.
Yep.
And I don't have this all worked out, but I think I'm of an age where I was raised in a dualistic kind of society. So you have to know who's right and who's wrong, and
we're going back to that.
Who's just and who's unjust. And I think we live in a quantum world where everything is connected to everything else. So when there's a situation to be mended, I don't think you mend it by taking sides. And I think that has been a tradition in the United Church. We've often done that. And what's happening in protests now that the United Church isn't doing, but I mean, even tonight on the news, there was, a discussion about whether they should prevent protests near schools and churches and so on, because people escalate protests into violence.
Yeah.
And seems to me, I really liked what Michael Blair had to say. We need to lament. We need to go deeper than who's right and who's wrong, and lament all the death and all the war, and somehow open ourselves to a power greater than ourselves, and admit sometimes we don't know the answers. And that may take us someplace that having all the solutions worked out don't.
Yeah, that's lovely, Yvonne. That's what I was thinking when you were speaking. I was thinking of Michael and his Psalms of Lament. And what if because the protests, I'm so glad you brought that up, because sometimes when I've been interviewed about the book, people really want to focus on like, what? Like, especially in the secular world, people go, what? Faith protests? How do you even put those in the same sentence? But think of the prophets, right? And in a faith context, you just go think of the prophets and everyone knows. What if we also went to, as congregants, went and knocked on the door of a denomination or a faith tradition that we've never met and asked what their concerns are? I used to have the great privilege of speaking to a lot of UCW groups, so it's just awesome. And they're just living faith as protest in vibrant energy. But I would always take note of what the congregations were as I drove into town and say, okay, you've got a Convention Baptist down the street. Have you talked to them? You've got a Greek Orthodox on the other corner. Have you talked to them? You've got a, Apostolic Church of Christ on another corner. Have you talked to them? What would that look like? And I mean, I don't have the answers. And some of it's going to be very much like Carmen's story, where some people will want to talk and some people will not want to talk. But what if we ask them to what the issues are that are on their hearts and minds, and where would they want to protest? It's not always just about the United Church figuring out what the agenda is, but
and I think we need to be looking to where people, rather than saying, well, how are we going to tell the government what to do? Take a look at people like that Still Standing group that you mentioned. Where
standing together.
Yeah. Where are there people who are already trying to talk to each other, who realize that they're brothers and sisters, even though they have totally different points of view? We're all part of each other, and they're somehow trying to find a way through this rather than sorting out who's right and who's wrong.
And it can be done. So another example was when the medical assistance in dying legislation was coming into effect in Canada. And I had the privilege of still being at the Canadian Council of Churches. So we just started talking there, and we started talking to all of the other faith groups. And people had different opinions. Different faith groups had different opinions, for sure, about what to do with medical assistance in dying. But we were talking together to try to figure out, is there somewhere in common that we can go? Is there something we can say to the government together? And you know what? All the faith traditions, all the Christian denominations, all wanted to say to the government, you're moving too quickly. There are huge issues in this. We don't know where we're going to come out as faith traditions exactly, but we urge you to slow down. Just slow down. And the government did it. And the perspectives ended up being different.
Yeah.
But
I'm on my phone, so I see that Lorraine Mackenzie Shepherd has got something to say there, so I'll just leave it. Hello, Lorraine. Anyway.
Oh, look at Lorraine's
Well,
comment.
Okay.
Lorraine's building on your comment, Yvonne, and says that I've found that interfaith vigils focused on prayer rather than speeches that further cement divisions is better able to see the other as human and not the enemy. And I love that. One of the things I did this fall was I attended the Caribbean and North American Regional Council of the World Communion of Reformed Churches. Poor me, I took one for the team and went to their General Assembly in Grand Cayman Island in October.
Oh, yeah, darn, that was hard.
But we were really blessed to have the president of the World Communion of Reformed Churches, who's one of the first dozen, I think, like one of the very first of a dozen ordained women in the Reformed tradition in the whole of the Middle East, Reverend Najla Kassab from Lebanon. And she had like managed to get out of Lebanon to come and join us in Grand Cayman. And she preached on, we had a global live stream of Reformation Sunday service from one of the churches in Georgetown. And she talked about how like we have to stop fighting about who's right and who's wrong and just stop killing each other. Like it's just as simple as that. And I found that really personally challenging because I do feel like we get into like when we talk about justice, it kind of means that there is a judgment of who's right and who's wrong, and that isn't always helpful. Like, so I do think that there is something about coming together in prayer and prayer is a good way to put it, because like even within the ecumenical movement, we can't always agree on what constitutes worship, right? And we have like one theoretical document that not everybody recognizes about baptism, Eucharist, and ministry, and what that means, and how we recognize the sacraments within the Christian tradition. But coming together to pray is something that we share across many faith traditions, and it is a way to sort of climb down into that deep dark hole of empathy that Brene Brown talks about and says like I can't possibly understand what you're feeling, but I'm here with you. And what a beautiful thing to say to your neighbor. And even if you don't agree with them. Right.
And the prayer, even when you don't understand the language, and that's a Canadian Council of Churches experience too. You can be there in prayer, and it doesn't always have to always be in English. Oh, I think Carmen is frozen. Oh no, we've lost the moderator.
Come back, Carmen. Come
back. No, we've lost her.
Okay, you're gonna have to wrap it up then, Karen.
Yep.
So you need to preview the next book and all of those things.
Sure. No, you can do that. I don't know the next book, Alan, but go for it.
I don't know what the next book is either. But we have hit. Let me find me too.
And I think Marion Party's on next, actually. I think she knows what the next book is.
Oh, awesome. Okay, Marion, you come and tell us what we're doing next then. Come on.
So poor Marianne, I put her on the spot totally.
Here I am. Oh, indeed. Thank you very much. Al Llewellyn and I are going to be the resource persons on the book, Bootstraps Need Boots. One Tory's lonely fight for poverty in Canada, or something like that, given that it's not in front of me, by the late Hugh Segal.
Fabulous.
And Hal and I, along with a couple of others, led a book study on Siegel's book, and seeing that unfortunately we don't have the late Honorable Hugh Siegel on Earth anymore, the moderator invited us to be the resource person. So I have my holiday rereading cut out for me, and looking forward to January with the moderator and Hal and all of you.
Well, isn't that good, Carmen? We managed
Yeah,
without you.
you did. You did the whole wrap up and everything. So
I know.
and the hotel where I'm staying, actually their whole internet system is down right now. So I had been dialed into this whole conversation through my hotspot on my phone. And I guess my phone was like, I need a break for a second.
Yeah, no kidding. And just, Marion, to follow up on what you just said, the very last issue that the very Reverend, the Honorable, spelt with a U, Lois M. Wilson engaged in was the guaranteed livable income. She was still pushing and pushing, as you know, because you were working with her on that, and that was sort of her issue with which she was engaging passionately.
She recruited me for the National GLI Network, so I have Lois to pay tribute to for my passion for guaranteed livable income.
Yeah.
Well,
Wonderful.
really looking forward to having you join us with Hal next month, Marion. And Karen, thank you so much for a rich discussion, and especially for sharing the things that are not maybe, because of page count limits and all that thing. Some of the background about like how you chose and why you chose. This book can be such a gift to, because I know many of our congregations do care deeply about interfaith dialogue. And I think, I hope that folks who have attended tonight and also who may watch this asynchronously later might feel called to take some personal action to build those relationships, because that piece came through really clear in everything you wrote about.
And there are links at the end of every chapter too, for those who want to do more and have more of an idea of what to do exactly.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
All right,
It's been an honor.
everybody. Thank you so much. We're taking a break for December because everybody will be very busy the week before Christmas. And we'll see you back here in January to talk about Bootstraps Need Boots, a Lone Tory's Guide to End Poverty in Canada by the late Hugh Siegel. And thanks again, everybody, for attending.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Such good questions. Very inspiring.